Okay, so we're going to talk about farmers, which is an important group in the late 1800s because they gave rise to what's called the populist movement. And we're going to look at how they influenced or maybe did not influence the federal government or attempted to influence the federal government. So first, let's start with some causes here. So why are these farmers kind of so important? Well, the farmers that were living in the West faced a difficult kind of life. They was this kind of rural, isolated lifestyle. You think about the Homestead Act that was passed in 1862. On the Great Plains, people were living in these farms that were isolated and far from towns, so they didn't have a lot of power, a lot of contact with a lot of other people. You also have in 1873 an economic depression that happens, the Panic of 1873, and the prices of the crops that they are growing drop significantly. Part of that is due to things like mechanization and more efficient means of producing crops, but the prices are dropping, so they're not making as much money. Also, in conjunction with that, with the railroad monopolies that were growing, the people like the Vanderbilts and stuff, the railroads cooperated with each other to set prices, so the prices were high to ship the goods to market. So you had this combination of a drop in prices and high shipping prices or high shipping rates. And this meant that farmers had a really difficult time making it economically. One of the things that they attempted to do was they attempted to kind of organize together with things like the Grangers and the Farmers Alliances. These are groups of farmers that kind of came together because they had a common interest. The Grangers were the first kind of group. They had about 800,000 members by in 1875, actually, that should be. And the Farmers Alliances, they had 4 million members in the South in 1875. Because remember, the South was also agricultural. So the Grangers were like more of a Western group, and in the Midwest, and the Farmers Alliances had the most power in the South. And so what they did is they kind of worked together. They formed cooperatives, basically trying to cut out the middleman, so they didn't have to pay somebody to get their goods to market and to sell the goods. They worked together so they could keep the money in their own pockets. Instead of having to pay somebody to sell their goods for them, they were able to sell it directly themselves. And they shared in the profits with the farmers. That's why it's called a cooperative, because they cooperate together. Another thing that happened was called the Crime of 73. And the crime of 73 was, the value of silver. Silver was used to coin money, and with silver being used as a basis for currency, that meant you'd have silver and gold, this idea of bimetallism. And so that means that there's a higher money supply, and that farmers wanted a higher money supply because the more money you print, the more money you have, more inflation, which means prices of the farm goods would rise. So in the crime of 73, what ends up happening is Congress actually stopped issuing silver coins, which shrank the money supply, which caused what's called deflation. So prices actually went lower. So for the farmers, they saw this idea of stopping the issuing of silver coins as an attack on them and their ability to make money to offset the drop in prices that was happening. Notice that the crime of 73 happens in the same year as the Panic of 1873. Okay, so we have effects here. So this is talking about the policy of the federal government. So one of the things that happens is there are attempts to influence at the state level first. So the Grangers, they elect people to state legislatures and actually gain control of some state legislators, right? So that means they have control of some state governments. And they're not running officially as Grangers. That's not a political party or anything, but they're called like anti-monopoly or reform parties because they're trying to change things. They're opposed to monopoly of the railroads. And one of the things they had success in was in regulating the railroad rates, kind of fixing this problem here of railroad monopolies. But because the courts were much more friendly to business than they were with workers and that sort of thing, the courts kind of undid the regulations because this is like laissez-faire capitalism at work here. Okay, so they had some short-term success, but ultimately they were not able to influence permanently the state governments. All right. They also had a problem with the failure of to be unified, right? So you have different interests. You had Midwestern farmers that were rural, white, middle class. You have farmers in the South that had white and black. So there's a lot of tension there between the white and black farmers. You know, a lot of the white Southern farmers did not want black farmers to be part of these farmers' alliances. So there's some disunity there. Also, there were elements of anti-Semitism, that means anti-Jewish feeling, as well as racism, which I mentioned. And you had these demagogues. A demagogue is somebody that goes around and they appeal to people's emotions and kind of prey on their fears about different things. So that lends itself to racism and anti-Semitism. So people like Tom Watson is an example of that. So the different interests of the farmers were not always aligned with each other, depending on the different region or race that you were in. Eventually, these they were absorbed by the Democrats. The kind of populist movement was absorbed by the Democrats in 1896. This is when William Jennings Bryan, that's the WJB here, he makes his cross of gold speech in which he says, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," basically advocating to have the crime of 73 undone, to have the coinage of silver to create those inflationary pressures to deal with the drop in prices. All right. Finally, there's actually failures at the national level here. So once the populist movement kind of moved onto the national scene, they met in 1892. They have the Omaha Platform, which they kind of laid out their beliefs. They wanted government-owned railroads. They wanted the coinage of silver. They also wanted some things like an income tax, more direct representation from the voters. None of those things actually happened. So they would happen later on after the 1900s, but at this point in the late 1800s, it did not happen. So it was kind of a failure here. You also have this group of people called Coxey's Army. They're not an actual army; it's just it's a big protest essentially. And Coxey was a populist, and they marched on Washington, asking the government to provide jobs for them. This is kind of during one of these economic panics. So that also, the government didn't do anything there because remember, it's laissez-faire capitalism, so the government's not going to get involved that much. Also, after the election of 1896, which the Republicans won, William McKinley wins. He's a Republican, a conservative. He defeats William Jennings Bryan and populist ideas. So populist ideas lose in the presidential election of 1896. And as a result, you have the Currency Act of 1900, which ties the country directly to the gold standard. So the coinage of silver that the Omaha Platform and William Jennings Bryan was talking about never happens. So the conservative victory of the gold standard remains the case. So farmers have a difficult time still, but the populist movement, those ideas will influence groups like the progressives a bit later on. Okay, so overall, I think it's fair to say that the populist movement kind of failed to enact any permanent change at that time, but later on, in 20 years or so, they're going to be much more influential.